to Work Bubble podcast. I'm your host, Laura, and I practice as a therapist in New York City. Today, we have a very special guest, Rebecca Ogle, LCSW. We're going to have an exciting and important conversation today about social work being political and social work and abolition. So I'm excited to dive in. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hi, so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you
Thanks
too.
for having me.
Of course. So Rebecca is the owner of Grounded Counseling. She's based in Illinois. Like I said earlier, she's an LCSW, and a big part of what she does is promoting anti-oppressive practice, anti-capitalism, and abolition. So Rebecca, that's a short synopsis about you. Is there anything else you'd like the listeners to know about your social work journey?
Yeah, I guess just that I started out wanting to be a teacher, and then I started meeting social workers through this AmeriCorps program that I did back in, I think that was like 2011, 2012.
Great.
And then from there, I just decided to get my MSW. I went to Loyola, graduated from there in 2014, and then I worked in community mental health nonprofit settings for about 6 or 7 years, including my internships. And then I transitioned into my solo practice. I think it was like 2.5. It was like right before the pandemic. So it was kind of interesting because I was doing all virtual before the pandemic started in October of 2019. And so then when everybody transitioned to virtual in 2020, I was like all ready to go. So that weirdly worked out for me, but yeah.
That's great. Wonderful. So a smooth transition there then.
Yeah.
Good. And I remember, your background in community mental health. I think I lasted 2 years in community mental health before I got a job at a private practice. So
yeah, I just listened to your episode on it, and a lot of it really resonated with me for sure.
Wonderful. All right. Well, we'll kind of dive into the topic today. Is there any space that you want to start in terms of being social work being political or social work and abolition?
Yeah, well, I guess I just want to start by saying that I'm not an expert in these topics, right? The reason that it's me speaking on these things is because I saw Laura's post on Instagram asking if anybody wanted to come on her podcast and what they wanted to talk about. And this is what's really important to me right now, what's really resonating with me and my followers on TikTok and Instagram right now. So I don't claim to be like a spokesperson for the abolition movement or anything. It's just something that I think we social workers should be talking about and exploring. And I owe a lot of what I know, all of what I know about it to women of color, Black women who have done all of the work in this movement. And so I thank them. And I have a bunch of people that I want to, like authors and activists and people that I want to shout out at some point. So
wonderful. And in the description of the podcast, we'll have all these resources linked, all the people that we talk about today. They'll be available to all of you listeners. So, okay.
Cool.
All right. Let's get started. So for you, what does it mean when you say social work is political?
Well, I think I have been political for almost my whole life. I've been on a journey of, I started out being liberal when I was in high school and college and kind of moved to becoming a leftist. But that identity for me was always very separate from my social work career. I think the reason is because it's not seen as, being political is not seen as professional. Right. And so that was kind of the message I always got from all my social work programs, that these are two separate parts of myself.
Right.
And then, in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered and we had the pandemic, and I just sort of had this, I don't know, this awakening that well, wait, why am I really started questioning, why am I separating these two parts of myself when so many people in my life and so many clients and I are all impacted directly by systems of oppression. Why is it that I can't talk about that? And so I started talking about it, and then now here we are, I guess.
Wonderful. That's very true, though. I mean, in my experience too, especially in undergrad, I went to a small SUNY like state school, and there it was very much like it was a conservative town. The university was really the only place that was liberal in any sense, but it was still preached to us like they're two separate things, which to me was interesting because the Code of Ethics explicitly talks about social justice and a lot of themes that come up in politics. And so it seems like they should be going together, especially if we are practicing ethically.
Right. And I think that's this tension that's been present in social work for as long as social work has been around, which is that, like in the 1920s and 30s, when the Red Scare was a really big deal, like a lot of social workers were blacklisted for being communist or being suspected of communism. And that was when social work as a field really moved into this era of promoting professionalism and kind of saying, well, we keep politics out of this. And that was really a way to gatekeep the profession and promote, white middle class people and weed out everybody else, which continues to be a problem even now. But yeah, I think it was really enlightening for me to learn about how the roots of that were really intentional in a lot of ways. And the book that I learned about that in is called,
Yes.
it's probably not good podcasting to have a break, but
You're good.
The Road Not Taken by Michael Reisch and Janice Andrews.
Okay.
So they talk about how social work became depoliticized, and that's the roots of a lot of it is in the Red Scare.
Oh wow, that's very interesting to say the least, but it shows a lot about our profession. And even I had mentioned the Code of Ethics, but even just within the NSAW, like a lot of the things that they talk about or policies that they have don't necessarily align with a lot of like explicitly anti-racist, anti-oppressive work. So in terms of, you had mentioned,
and I was going to say about that, so that phrase about, social workers promoting social justice, it was a fight to get that phrase in the Code of Ethics. And I think it sort of was like a lot of things in our neoliberal society, which is like, we fought to get the wording in there, but like, what does it really mean? And like, what actions is like what actions is social work agreeing to with that phrase being in there? Because I've experienced, and I'm sure a lot of people have experienced, trying to get my previous workplaces and the nonprofits I worked for to really advocate for clients and policy changes, and like they just don't spend a lot of time doing that. And I kind of finally realized that the reason is because it doesn't really benefit them. Like ultimately their goal is to keep the nonprofit open, and those clients having more resources doesn't, I think in their mind, I don't know if this is actually true, but I think in their mind it doesn't accomplish that goal. So
yeah, that's very true, because inherently working for social justice is, as social workers, meaning we're working to eventually unemploy ourselves, that we should not be able to be social workers if we achieve what the goal is. And so we're inherently working against ourselves. And I mean, and all of that comes with it, which I think is something that drives a big foundation of why we're not working in social justice and anti-oppressive work, is people like job stability, honestly.
Yeah, and I think that's why the NASW isn't, because in my mind, I don't know what your feelings on the NASW are, and I will say the New York chapter is like unmatched in terms of like, I just feel like they're very more sort of knowledgeable in terms of what social workers care about right now and what our clients care about. But I would say in general, I think the NASW's goal is to promote the profession. So their goal is not to protect social workers, offer more job benefits or higher salaries. Their goal is not to advocate for clients. It really is just for them to continue to be employable. So yeah, so I don't have a lot of faith in the NASW in terms of like change going forward for the field. But that's also part of me being an abolitionist. About that too. But.
Yeah, absolutely. You had mentioned earlier just political ideology that you personally fell into. Do you feel in social work, with social work values, is it a particular political ideology that I guess like falls within a social worker is what's most helpful for our values?
That is such an interesting question, because I think it really depends on like who you ask, right?
Very true.
So if you ask me, I would say for myself, I think social work aligns with leftist ideology. I think social workers promote looking at things from a person and environment perspective and looking at how systems of oppression are impacting people. I think social work is really big on making decisions for yourself, right? And being able to have the freedom to do that. But if you ask another social worker who has conservative views, they will say, well, social work fits perfectly with my views because I don't even know what reasons, but I'm sure they have them, right? And so I think, again, it just kind of speaks to the lack of there's just so much dissent about what is social work. Why are we doing this? What are the values and ideologies that are driving this work? And it's sort of, social work kind of has an identity crisis in that way. And I think that's partly why so many people don't understand what we do, don't understand who we are, because we don't even know who we are, right?
That is very, very true. Yeah, because there's all these myths about who social workers are, and that can certainly stem from, right, the identity crisis that you speak of. Very interesting. In terms of like anti-oppressive work, what to you does that look like in social work?
So to me, that really looks like looking at our clients not as just one individual whose personality is the driving thing behind their behavior. It's really looking at how systems of oppression, whether that's, racism, sexism, classism, capitalism, how those things impact their mental health. And also looking at our interventions, right? And I think the interventions that we are taught in school, whether we went to school for and their school operated from like a CBT mindset or a psychodynamic mindset, I think the thing that we really miss in all social work programs is that activism and self-advocacy and community advocacy are also interventions. And they're also things that can really improve not only our mental health and well-being and stability, but also like our material circumstances, which makes such a difference in our mental health, right? Whether we have housing or not, whether we have access to food, whether we have a job that's, draining the life and soul out of all of these things contribute to our mental health. And so I think it's really looking at that.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me too of just how we show up for our clients. I do think, especially as a white social worker, and when I was working in community mental health and I worked with more Black and Brown families, for them, just the dynamic of cross-cultural therapy was a thing in itself. But if I wasn't the one to initiate the conversation on how race showed up in their life, like when George Floyd was murdered, I ran a parent support group and I was like, how is everyone doing? And they were like, oh, we're great, we're fine. And it wasn't until I was like, let's talk about like what happened. Like as a white social worker, I want you to know that I stand with you and that I'm advocating in this way. And it wasn't until I said the piece where the wall kind of came down and they were like, yeah, this week has completely sucked. People started crying. Like we got into this conversation about, being a Black mother and then having to, like, what resources, especially in New York when police brutality is incredibly out of hand, like how can you support your autistic son when the mental health crisis team is called and then SWAT shows up? And so we got into these really important conversations that I think for them helped our rapport as a client and therapist.
Totally.
Because it's really easy to show up and say, and like do those common interventions. But I think it also shows more genuine care and concern when clients can see you are actually standing with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think, I don't know what your experience was, but for me, and from what I've heard from a lot of social workers, it really feels like, so number one, a lot of the way that social work school addresses this is through cultural competency, which what even is that? Or even
Right.
cultural humility. Again, what does that even mean?
Mm-hmm.
But it feels very much like sort of a thing that's tacked on at the end, like, oh yeah, and we have to talk about this thing real quick. We have one class on this. I had one class on that. Now, granted, that was also in 2011. So I'm hopeful that things have gotten a little better since then, but from what I've heard, not much.
Yeah.
And it was like, we really only talked about it in that class. Other than that class, talking about how systems of oppression impact clients' mental health didn't really come up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so effed up, because for our clients, it comes up all the time, every day,
Mm-hmm.
And so I think anti-oppressive practice is also about, this isn't just something we're going to tack on to the end. This is a lens through which we're going to view our work together. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to make sure, like you were talking about, as a white social worker, that I'm listening and learning from my clients, and also from people in my community, activists, and trying to constantly check my own biases. Like, that's not something that you get to do once and then you just never come back to it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you as a therapist constantly have to be checking your biases. And I think that's, well, I'm going off on a tangent, but I think that's also right, the part of supervision and consultation, that we really should be using supervision and consultation to be doing that. And how often do we really use it for those things, right?
That's very true. Yeah. In my undergrad, we did not have one single diversity or cultural competence class at all. And it was interesting because the director, acknowledged it, but I'm like, okay, so then what? Like, you're just going to say, oh, yeah, we should have that, but it's never there. And I think it's also interesting how a lot of universities put the burden on professors of color to do those classes, which is important that obviously we recognize those voices and don't have like white people like taking over the space. But then you're also expecting these people with their own trauma and space to then make that their experience teachable. And that's always rubbed me the wrong way, is like, and agencies and practices relying on, Black therapists and other therapists of color to be the ones to lead the diversity and lead the cultural competence.
Totally. And not only professors, but also students. I think a lot of Black and Indigenous and Latinx students felt really like all their white classmates were like looking at them every time this came up, or looking at them to lead the conversation. And like, that's a lot of pressure and burden anyway.
Yes. In terms of anti-oppressive work, while I was, creeping on you, getting some background on you, your website had mentioned the Liberation Health Framework. So I'm wondering if we could kind of dive into that a little bit, like what exactly that is, and then what the impact of using this framework is in practice.
Yeah, so I am so glad you brought this up, because this is something that has really transformed the way I see social work, and really like put the pieces in place of, okay, like, yes, I want to do social work from a social justice anti-oppressive lens, but like, how do I do that? And so I think the Boston Liberation Health Project answers, how do I do that? So they have a website, which I can give you the address of at some point, that like has a ton of free resources on it. They have a Facebook group that I think anyone can join, and they have like free consultations where people use the model. But basically, it's a model of conceptualizing your cases through an anti-oppressive lens that's looking at all of these different systems that your client is a part of. And then there's also a book. The book is expensive, but for me, it was so worth it, because it also explains the history behind like how this started. And basically, my understanding of it is that there was a group of clinicians at an agency in Boston
Mm-hmm.
who directly, interviewed and talked to their clients about how can we improve the quality of our services? Like, how do you conceptualize your problems? And then that's how this model was born. So it really was born from the clients themselves, which again is
Mm.
like, why isn't that how we're doing everything?
Yes.
Because like that's what social work claims to do, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
conceptualize things through our clients' eyes and see the walk in their shoes and blah blah blah. And so like
Mm-hmm.
this was an example of them like really doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So I love this model
Mm-hmm.
in the center, and then you're looking at the problem through the lenses of personal, cultural, and institutional factors.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like as social workers and therapists, we always look at the personal factors. We're really good on that. We sometimes look at the cultural factors, but how often do we look at the institutional factors and use
Mm-hmm.
that to understand what our clients are going through, what barriers they're facing,
Mm-hmm.
what's helping and not helping them, how they're being policed, right?
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I'm a big
Wonderful.
fan.
Wonderful. And like I said earlier, all the links and information will be below for all the listeners to, find out more and really dive into how they can use this framework in practice. Wonderful. Okay. Now we're going to switch gears. Not even switch gears. It kind of overlaps, right? So social work and abolition. I know in some people, when I first heard the term abolition, like my mind went straight to like the Underground Railroad, like thinking about abolition in that way, right? Because it was a very new concept for me. And I think for many people, it also seems very extreme. But the more I've learned about it, the more I'm just like, yes, this is what we need, especially when we look at a lot of research and actually how effective it can be. So for you, why don't we get started and just say, what is abolition? What does that even mean?
Yeah, so I think abolition is really about envisioning a better, safer world for ourselves and our children and our communities. And so I think you're totally right that a lot of people, when they hear abolition, think like Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman and stuff. I also think a lot of people hear, so you're just saying we should get rid of the police?
Mm-hmm.
And are kind of like, well, wait, and I also thought this when I first heard it, like, what do you mean? Like, what happens if we just get rid of the police? But that's only part of the equation, right? The
Mm-hmm.
other part of the equation that people forget about is it's also abolition is also about like imagining a different way to go about things. So like
Mm-hmm.
I love this quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who was the founder of the organization Critical Resistance, who said abolition is about presence, not absence. It's
Mm-hmm.
about which I think she means like how do we be present for each other
Mm-hmm.
in a different way, and also emphasizing it's not just about getting rid of something, it's also about recreating something.
Yes, absolutely. Finding a true resolution. Also, I mean, especially when we talk about the police, like people think that solves problems, but it's a reaction to something. It's not actually changing anything except making things worse, really. So in practice, what does abolition look like?
So it looks like a lot of different things, but I think one is looking at eliminating not only police, but
Mm-hmm.
also all different forms of policing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's the prison industrial complex, which a lot of
Yes.
people have heard of, right? And I think under that umbrella, there's also the child welfare system.
Mm,
There's also involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. Like policing takes many different forms.
yes.
And so I think that, oh, there's also carceral crisis response teams, right? So
Mm-hmm.
call 911 and because you're in a mental health crisis and you need help and a policeman shows up in a car with flashing lights, like
Mm-hmm.
that's so triggering for so many people, and it often escalates the situation. And
Yes.
unfortunately police are way like more than 10 times more likely to kill somebody who's having a mental health crisis than somebody
Mm-hmm.
who's not, which really just goes to show you, number one, they're not equipped to be doing that job, because there's no reason why people in a mental health crisis should be killed. Like, they're not any more violent than anybody who's not in a mental health crisis. And also, like, it just prevents people from reaching out for help, because if the help that you're going to get could be fatal, like, forget it. I'm just going to try to figure this out on my own. Right. So yeah. And I think abolition does sound really extreme, but I think there's like a spectrum, and I think there are a lot of abolitionists who are, advocating to like defund the police as well as just like abolish the police, and like kind of taking these steps that are getting us closer to this long-term vision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned though too that, I mean, even for myself, sometimes I go right to thinking it's just like the prison industrial system and then the police, and that's it, right? But as social workers, we are a huge part of the policing system in America. And like we were talking about earlier, in terms of social work being political, like part of our work, the goal should be to eventually no longer need us, so we can do our job well, especially when we're the ones that are part of the problem.
Well, right, because when you think about it, like, why do we need social workers at all? Well, it's because there's wealth inequity, there's, people with severe mental illnesses who don't have access to other types of help. If those things didn't exist, you wouldn't need us. And so, like, yeah, I think abolishing social work is also part of abolition, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Which you've kind of described this already, but more explicitly, why is abolition important?
It is important because reforming what we currently have in place is not enough. And I think what led me to that conclusion was I read, this is like kind of ironic, but anyway, I read Resmaa Menakem's, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, book, My Grandmother's Hands.
Okay.
And so he is a trauma specialist who worked with the police force in Minneapolis in the hopes of basically training them so that they could heal their own trauma so that they would not be imposing violence at other people, right? And, he did all these workshops. There's been a lot of people who have done, specifically in Minneapolis, a lot of work around reforming the police. And it has not had the result that we need, which is for police to stop killing innocent people.
Yeah.
So, so I think that was sort of what led me to the conclusion that, like, because I think people might also say, well, you just need to give reform time. You just need to give it time. But like, we don't have time. Right. People are dying now. Like, so yeah. So that's why I think it's gotta be abolition and not reform, because, and that's just one example, right? There's a lot of examples of how reform has been ineffective and unhelpful and a waste of everybody's time and money. But and the other way I kind of look at it is like, it would be like if people were saying, well, the KKK isn't a bad institution, it just needs to be reformed. So like, when you hear how that sounds, it's like, wait, that doesn't make sense.
No.
And like, that's kind of, I mean, that's kind of how I see the police and policing, because the fact is a lot of police were and are members of the KKK. And like, that is going back to the roots of policing in the United States. Was policing started in the United States because people were rounding up escaped slaves. And so, there is a link there. Like, it's like people might go, oh my God, that's ridiculous to compare the police to KKK. It's really not. They're actually pretty linked in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. I think something important too is, especially in talking about abolition, I know for some people it can seem like, okay, what about survivors of violence, victims of crime? What's their perspective? But a big part of the abolition movement is done by survivors, that those that want to see that change happen because they know that's what works. Can you tell us more about kind of the voice of survivors in this?
Yeah, I mean, and like you are going to hear dissenting opinions from people.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. There are always going to be people who say, no, we need the police. That's how we're going to be safe. But I've also heard from a lot of survivors that, and when I say survivors, I think you mean this too. Like I'm saying like survivors of rape, assault,
Yes.
domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of them have not found the police helpful, and in some
Mm-hmm.
ways have found the police to be harmful.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, again, like, why would you reach out to police if they could escalate the situation
Mm-hmm.
or further traumatize you, put your life in danger, all these things? Like, we need systems and resources that people can reach out to where they really feel safe. And,
Mm-hmm.
I think as social workers, we really want to believe that we are those resources, but that's not always true either, because people know that we're mandated reporters, and
Mm-hmm.
that is a part of our job, is that we have to do that. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
people don't always feel safe to tell us about what's going on at home in a lot of detail, or tell us
Mm-hmm.
about their suicidal thoughts and the full detail of what's happening with them, because they know that, like,
Mm-hmm.
we are policing that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It makes it difficult for those people to get the support that they need. Mm,
Totally.
yeah.
Oh, but that reminds me,
Yes.
speaking of a way that we can practice abolition in practice,
Mhm.
I think one thing that I have found really helpful is reading a lot about what people's legal rights actually are when
Mm,
they have a DCFS case open, or like when they are sent to the ER for suicidal thoughts or whatnot.
mhm,
And then being able to educate clients about that. And
mm,
even just, when you ideally you would do this in the first session every time
mhm,
with a client, but also every time a client starts to go down a path that you think might lead to something you have to report, like stopping them and saying, okay, I just want to remind you, I'm a mandated reporter. These are
mhm.
the things that I have to call in. And the other thing that you can do is really involve the client in the process of calling,
Yes.
um, and empower them to make decisions about, do you want to talk or do you want me to talk? And kind
Mhm,
of talking about before the call, here's what I'm going to say, here's what I
mhm,
have to say, here's what we can leave out. And really, during that call, highlighting the client's strengths,
mm.
giving all the information you have to give them, but not giving more information than you have to give them. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Mhm.
So I think, and again, like, that's not something you're ever gonna learn about in a social work training, because in a
Mhm.
social work training, what they will say is, if you have even the slightest suspicion, you should just call.
Right. Which is
And
horrifying because, I mean, that's also so subjective, and you get social workers that are, I mean, just as racist and oppressive and discriminatory, saying, oh, they're wearing a dirty, ripped shirt. Let me call child protection.
yeah,
Mm,
yeah. Exactly. So it's really been in talking to other abolitionist social workers, and
mhm.
like within my networks, that I've sort of like come to that, yeah, like
Mhm.
that way of approaching mandated reporting, because it's like so many people are so scared to talk about it at
Mhm.
all, like scared of losing their license, scared of getting
Yeah.
sued. It's just, but
Mhm.
like, I think we need to be talking about it and thinking about it with more nuance.
Absolutely. And I think that pulls into agency policy, because when I was in community mental health, I was working with a client that was suicidal, and she had attempted to end her life, and so that was a moment where we had to get her evaluated just to make sure that she was safe. And you were talking about like having them involved and on the call, and so I let her call, and she was able to head down to the hospital to get evaluated, and I got in trouble for that because it went against agency
Really?
policy, which I thought was wild, because to me, I'm just like, wouldn't isn't this the ideal situation that like they didn't have to feel like I was forcing them to go, that they were willingly going. And so that's also a conversation to have, and how that intertwines with agency policy, and how a lot of agencies just promote rules and standards that aren't really helpful at all.
Yeah, and can be harmful too. And I think that encountering that in my agency work was a lot of what A, pushed me out of agency work, and B, again, like informed my view of social work as being political, because I felt complicit in harmful things that I did because of agency policies. And I'm like, I'm still like, that still keeps me up at night. I'm still mad about it, And like, I don't know, like one example I can give is I had a client who requested to switch psychiatrists, and the agency policy is you're not allowed to switch psychiatrists. But this psychiatrist said something really inappropriate to her that made her really uncomfortable. And so their solution was, well, you just go to the next appointment with her and sit in with her, which I did, and it did make her feel better. But when you think about it, like, that doesn't make any sense, because anybody with private insurance can go to any psychiatrist they want. And if they don't like them the first visit, or they say something inappropriate, they'll just switch. And it's just so deeply unfair that because somebody has Medicaid or Medicare, they have to see a harmful provider or see nobody at all. Like, what?
Yeah.
But that is the reality for so many people. And it's like, and then they had the same policy with you're not allowed to switch therapists, which again, like, in private practice, it's like you keep finding therapists until you find someone that's the right fit.
Right.
And it's almost like, to me, it feels like we're punishing people for being low income. Which, what? Like, that's so wrong. Anyway, it just gets me really.
It just feels like, I mean, a big power trip, honestly, like for agencies to have the audacity to think that people that need support, like you can just tell them what to do, when a tenet of social work is supposed to be being client-centered, and self-determination and all this stuff. Like, where is that really? Because it's not there.
Absolutely. Well, and I can tell you, I did try to tell people what to do because of agency policies. And a lot of times people are like, no, you can't tell me what to do, which good for them, honestly.
Yes.
Like, but I think there were so many ethical dilemmas I ran into that it felt like there was nobody I could go to, because if I go to my supervisor, well, obviously she's going to just say whatever the agency policy is, because that's her job. She doesn't want to lose her job.
Right.
I totally get that. But then it's like, well, where do you go when your agency has policy, or any workplace really has policies that you feel are unethical? There were times when I tried to call the NASW ethics line. I don't know if you've ever done that.
I haven't done it. I was going to mention this.
Truly the most unhelpful experience. Like, they were honestly just like, well, which code of ethic do you think this refers to? And I was like, okay, well, I think it violates this and this.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe you could report it to OIG. That doesn't go anywhere. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, and also anything you do puts your job at risk,
right.
Which most people do not have the privilege of putting their job at risk to whistleblow on unethical policies. So, like, again, like, there's a real power differential there where, like, and so this is the other thing. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm really fired up. I think social work tries really hard to separate clients and clinicians as two different sets of people. And I think the reason for that is because if clinicians feel like we are somehow superior to or more together than clients, then we're less likely to really advocate with them and on their behalf, and like see ourselves as being in community with each other. And I think what social work would say is, well, yeah, because that's bad boundaries. But the other thing is that it prevents social movements from really gaining traction that
Mm,
include clients and clinicians. And
mm.
the thing is like a lot of times we do have more in common, even with mental health agency clients, than we think, because,
Oh, yeah.
you know, we're all affected by these systems of oppression and sometimes in different ways, but like we're all being exploited. None of us
Mhm.
are benefiting. Like if we all worked together, we would be unstoppable. But
Mhm.
I think again, like there's some intentionality in social work to make sure. And the reality is that a lot of us are clients and clinicians.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
we know this. Like we
Mhm.
all know that we get into this field for a reason. And a lot of times we have our own mental health issues, we have our own trauma, we have our own family of origin stuff.
Mm.
But there's just so much investment in making sure that we're two separate groups.
Yeah. That's very true. And for me, it brings up to the dynamic between practice and clinicians, right? And I've kind of used this expression that it reminds me of an abusive relationship, right? Where so much of social work in school, you're taught you're underpaid, you're going to be stressed out, working long hours. So you're like desensitized to the fact that that's going to be your reality. And then it's
Mhm.
so fear operated, like you'll lose your license, you'll lose your job, violate
Mhm.
ethics. And then you get into the work and you're just like, okay, well, I have to pay my bills and I can't lose my license, I can't lose my job. And so it just keeps us in the space of policing and following through with these rules and these standards that aren't really humane.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is like an abusive relation. And there's so much gaslighting that happens too. And I
Yeah.
think this is really in every workplace
Hmm.
where, you know, you try to bring up issues and problems or say, I'm having a hard time. And it's, well, you need to do more self care. Well, you're not looking at the good side, you
Hmm.
know, like that toxic positivity. And it really gets in your head because you start thinking, man, maybe it is me. Like maybe I'm
Hmm.
the only one who is struggling with this so much. However, when you start talking one on one with your coworkers and kind of getting them to open up, what you will find out is you are not the only one.
Hmm.
Everybody is in so I mean, sometimes it's, you know, the odd person who, but a lot of people are also noticing the same stuff you're noticing, and it's just that
Hmm.
nobody feels like they can bring it up.
Mm. Very true. Very true. And that all just ties into perpetuating oppression, systems that really are just continuing to cause harm, not only on our clients at a direct level, but just to society as a whole.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Is I feel like our liberation is tied up with the liberation of our clients. And
Mm.
I think we spend so much time looking at the differences between people when really, like, a lot of us want the same things, have the
Mm-hmm.
same values. We want safety for our families. You know, we want to feel loved and accepted and appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think there's definitely room for movements to grow where we work together to achieve those aims.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. If we were to break this down to a more like actionable plan, right? How we can implement abolition at a micro, meso, and macro level, what could that look like, do you think? It's a big question, I know.
It's been a long time since I heard micro, meso, and macro. Um, so yeah, so I would say again at a micro level, it's definitely like educating ourselves on anti-oppressive practice, doing our own trauma work and healing so that we're not
Hmm.
perpetuating those things with our clients and in our communities.
Yes.
Oh yeah, and then like empowering our clients as
Hmm.
far as, you know, a variety of interventions that may include like may like sometimes I'll suggest to clients who are really struggling at work, like, have you thought about organizing in your workplace?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, using a variety of interventions that include activism and advocacy. Meso. What is meso? Is that
Like communities, small
neighborhoods?
groups, neighborhoods. Yes.
Um, yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, getting involved with your well, okay, hold on a second. Are we saying this for social workers or just anybody or
For social workers.
For social work. Okay, good. That makes it a little easier. Yeah, so I would say finding out like what is happening in your local community in terms
Yeah.
of activism and advocacy and bills that are trying to get passed and writing witness slips and going to protests and again just finding other like-minded social workers in your area and talking to them and asking how they're involved and how you can help. And I would say that would be meso. And then macro, I feel like I hear people all the time say, we need a national social work union, or like, we need to connect all of these social workers who are doing all this work in different states. And I think that would be so cool if we could figure out how to do that. And that would be macro.
Wonderful. Yeah, that would be incredible. Oh, wow. And I think would just allow for, I mean, just that unity and connectedness, right? We were talking about earlier how social work has that identity crisis. And if we actually form connection, like how much that could also help us figure out who we are and what we're supposed to be doing.
Totally. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is this is probably micro meso, but like political education, sharing with people, like what podcasts you're listening to, what accounts you're following, what books you're reading. I think all that stuff is so important to these movements too.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember in community and mental health, I helped, I don't even know, probably like 20 of my clients register to vote because they just didn't have, access to that. And so keeping that in mind too, like these people want their voice to be heard and we can help them do that.
100%.
Wonderful. All right, Rebecca. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And thank you everyone for listening. For the listeners out there, where can they continue to follow your journey?
So my Instagram is at Grounded Counseling. My TikTok is at socialworker_Rebecca.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments on whatever platform you're listening on. And I look forward to continuing growing together in the wonderful field of social work.